Lies of P is the Souls-like game that comes the closest to From Software's formula, but it manages to add enough that it makes the experience an interesting one. At its core, Lies of P is still very obviously a love letter. It melds design philosophy and mechanics from virtually every From Software Souls experience. There are elements of Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and Sekiro all mashed together, and for the most part, Neowiz Games manages to make it work. It's not a perfect game though, and there are some issues I have with it, but for a first attempt into this hardcore action RPG style, I'm pretty impressed. While I'm going to criticize some aspects of the game, I just hope Neowiz continues to make Souls-like games. Overall, I very much enjoyed my time with Lies of P. I just want to point out some things that I think could be better in future games. This video is just going to be some thoughts on what I like and don't like in Lies of P. If you enjoy the video, remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be notified of future uploads. Before I get into it, I'll say that of course this is going to be entirely subjective, it's implied here. On top of that, while I will reference From Software's games here and there, I'm using them as a point of reference. Lies of P is not a one-for-one in what it demands of you mechanically to any of the games. It has its own unique requirements to get through comfortably, but it's similar enough to draw some comparisons. First off, Lies of P is gorgeous. It really is a visually stunning experience. From beautiful environments to awesome looking enemies to fight, the game was pretty impressive. This is aided by the setting, which is by far my favorite thing about Lies of P. Dark Pinocchio style action RPG is such a juicy concept, and then they add some really surprising stuff later on that I wasn't expecting, and I won't spoil it here. The story overall is okay. It's not bad, it's not amazing, it just is what it is with some fun moments here and there. There's a lot more dialogue in Lies of P than I was expecting, and the story is told to you straight for the most part. There's still some cryptic stuff, but it's not nearly as cryptic as your typical game in this genre. Another really awesome part about Lies of P is the weapon assembly. Being able to craft around and make a weapon wholly catered to your preferred playstyle is one of the coolest features for a game of this sort. Player creativity and choice is super freeing here. You can mix and match the properties of any non-boss weapon and make something you really enjoy using. Wrench head on a booster glaive handle to fly around and still do massive damage? No problem. A very lewd weapon? You can do that too. It's a fun way to get players to experiment and find some wacky stuff to take on the areas and bosses with. The boss weapons are no slouches either, and have some very fun movesets to play around with. There are a lot of weapons to use, and it's dope. The actual combat in Lies of P is pretty familiar, but continues down the thought process of player choice. In most of From Software's Soulsborne games, dodging is your main means of defense and avoiding damage. There's blocking in the Souls games and Elden Ring, and that can be very effective depending on your build and shield, but if you're not running something that can block, dodging is your only friend. All of their games have a form of parrying that's a high risk, high reward mechanic. If you can get the tight timing of a parry just before an enemy strikes, you get an opportunity for a high damage attack that gives you a moment to breathe. Sekiro is the most different in mentality, focusing on that parry mechanic, leaving the block and dodge ideas as backup rather than your primary form of defense. In Lies of P, every single defensive option is a viable choice. The perfect parry is ideal and clearly the most optimal way to play. The parry causes you to break down the enemy, and that'll give you an opportunity to use a heavy attack for a stagger much faster than just dealing damage. Blocking is also an effective option, but you'll take chip damage if you choose this option. Thanks to a rallying system, similar to Bloodborne, this is not as much of a punishment as you'd think. You can either attack or parry the next strike to regain the chip damage that you took, making blocking a decently effective choice. Dodging is kinda the last option, but it's still not a bad one. You get a dash dodge like in Bloodborne when you're locked onto an enemy, and a dodge roll when not locked on. You can be punished more easily than other options, and it's not nearly as forgiving as From Software's games with iframes. The dodges are much slower in Lies of P, but can still be used in a pinch with proper timing. Because all of the defensive options are viable, every attack an enemy throws is a choice the player has to make based on what's best for them. If you're confident you can parry all three, do that. If you're uncomfortable parrying the first strike in a combo, you can opt to block, then parry the next hit that you know the timing on, and maybe that last hit you want to dodge so you can get some quick hits after to replenish the chip you took during the block. The point is, having multiple defensive options at your disposal means you can react in almost any way to handle an encounter, and that's a great feature. Obviously for red attacks you need to perfect parry or luckily dodge or be far enough away, but those are exceptions. To actually attack enemies, you have your normal light and heavy attacks that are typical for these kinds of games, and then Fable Arts. Fable Arts are dependent on both your blade and handle, so most are pretty unique. This is kinda standard, but the Fable Arts are fun to use for certain weapons. Utilizing everything in your arsenal with a barrage of different attacks you can muster up makes every single fight you encounter a dance that you can turn into something cool. Lies of P can wind up really flashy when you get the hang of the combat, and I love that. There's so much personality in this game. The Legion arm is an awesome tool to add to your arsenal, but I didn't use it all that much. It functions like the prosthetic arm in Sekiro, and there are some flashy gadgets you can use to change up your combat loop. I love this, and despite not using them that much, I think they're all interesting and cool to use. Sekiro is my favorite From Software game, and to be honest, I like Lies of P's gadgets better. The combat loop works really well for the bosses, and I liked most of them. Visually, each boss is pretty distinct, and their individual movesets work very well in ensuring that the player uses everything at their disposal to take them on. It's easy to get into a satisfying flow state with the bosses when you start to understand them and make use of everything in your arsenal. None were too overwhelming, but some definitely gave me a run for my money. Even the bosses I managed to best on my first try saw me learning mid-fight, leaving me with next to nothing afterwards. This was an extremely refreshing experience for me, and I welcomed the challenge. Except this thing. I hate this thing. Overall though, I really enjoyed the major boss fights throughout the game. They looked cool and had some fantastic cinematics before the fights. They got me hype, and I don't want to spoil them too much, so we'll move on. I think these are some of my favorite bosses in any Souls-like overall, and that's incredible. Let's get into the stuff I didn't like in Lies of P. My first one is an issue with most of these types of games: backstabs on other stalkers. This is an issue in Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Elden Ring as well. You can just sidestep all NPC fight encounters and make the fight something pitiful. Both Bloodborne and Sekiro didn't really allow you to do this. I mean, you can still do some silly stuff to make it easier, but it's not as bad in those two. In Bloodborne, you charge a heavy attack and then visceral attack, and in Sekiro, you could maybe get a stealth attack for one of the health bars. Sometimes you could fiddle around and get both of them, but that's not always the case. These NPCs are considered bosses in Lies of P, and I wish you actually had to fight them face to face. However, they can easily be broken by just walking around and waiting for the end of the combo for a backstab. Sure, you can self-impose this challenge on yourself, but I just think that the backstab should be removed for bosses. You can't backstab mini-bosses, you can't backstab main bosses. Why can you backstab stalkers? There's no PvP in this game, so it's not necessary to have them in order to keep the immersion going. It's just a weird thing to have when you can still pop off those cool stagger attacks by doing damage and getting parries. I really think the stalker fights are pretty cool thematically, and actually fighting them head on and parrying to break their weapons is fun. So it's just a shame that they're so easily broken when they make up a considerable portion of the total boss fights, and the rest that aren't stalkers are so good. The only other thing I'm not too fond of in Lies of P is the leveling system. The weapons are built with creativity in mind, which is amazing, but you can change any weapon to scale with your preferred stat. This kind of makes leveling up feel like it's just something in the game to be in the game, and while health and stamina can be upgraded along with your capacity, I think Lies of P would have been better off with something akin to Sekiro. Skill points to use to gain new abilities, and then ways to increase your health and attack power would have worked much better in my opinion. I like the idea of being able to level up and unlock abilities for your character by using the quartz in the game, but there are some unlocks like being able to roll on the ground and link dodges that I think should have been included in the base mechanics, not as upgrades. The rest of the upgrades for Pinocchio are very cool, and I like that there's a separate system that's far more interesting to upgrade than just numbers for the typical RPG stats. This isn't a huge deal, it just feels a little bit off considering how much better the movement feels when you unlock these, and they're not so powerful of an upgrade that they make it so much easier. I think they could have been included. A lot of people have mentioned the poise as a problem, and personally, I didn't mind it all that much. Maybe on smaller enemies it can be a bit more annoying, but it just means you have to be a lot more deliberate with your actions. You can't just spam, and I think that's good for this style of game. Overall, I think Lies of P is a very good game, with a few things I hope to see improved upon for future games. I was pleasantly surprised with how well put together this game is for a first foray in the genre. It's pretty dang polished. Like I said earlier, Liza P has its own personality. It's got flair. I think it stands out and has enough care and attention to detail to be a game that's very well worth playing if you like these kinds of games. It's a competent game that has all the pieces to give a challenging but fair experience and look flashy while doing it. Great enemy design, great bosses, awesome weapon system, and beautiful unique environments make for an enjoyable time. The few issues the game has are not enough to really mar the experience enough to do anything other than add some slight annoyances. Lies of P, good game.